Hello, everyone. My name is Eugene Kukshinov, and regretfully, I couldn't get the visa in time, so I couldn't attend the conference, but I would still would love to present you our research about perspective taking in VR. So this study is about whether VR can by itself induce perspective taking, which is, along with empathy, is a form of mentalizing or a process of thinking about others. In It can take various forms. In our study, we distinguish four types of perspective taking. For example, effective other-related perspective taking is a process of thinking what would other feel would feel in a situation, or a cognitive self-focused perspective taking is a process of thinking what would I think in the same situation. However, this is not how perspective taking is usually conceptualized in VR studies. In VR studies, we often see multiple assumptions regarding what VR does to its users, like what VR can make them, like that VR can make them someone else, or make them think and understand someone just because they use an avatar in VR. However, seeing from the perspective of a virtual character is not the same as thinking about them and taking their perspective. Perspective taking requires effort, and it can be trained or stimulated through a perspective taking exercise or a task. So, to study the capability of VR to naturally induce perspective taking, we conducted a study with whether first person perspective or a third person perspective, and with either perspective taking task or without it. We hypothesized that perspective taking task will increase perspective taking expressions, as well as that first person perspective will possibly increase them as well, and that the sense of embodiment would be higher for participants in the first person perspective. We were also not sure how perspective taking expressions will differ across different types of perspective taking, so we tested this too. We sampled university students here in Canada, and the final sample was 96 participants for 4 conditions. The groups were not different significantly in regards to gender or age. The virtual environment was designed specifically for this study. It is a virtual factory that represents an unusual space and the role for participants. There is an NPC that delivered 2 messages to the participants, like you can see on the left message that represents third person perspective. And on the right, you can see the first person perspective. The virtual environment is available via GitHub. So once participants completed the consent form, all of them were told that their character is the safety officer on the factory who makes the decision there. Then they were told to speak out loud all the time and read the text in the text boxes out loud as well. And those in the perspective taking task condition were also asked to think about what their character would feel or think in the situation. And then they entered the virtual environment, and after that, filled out the questionnaire. So in this scenario, for the first 30 seconds, participants just observe the virtual scene. Then the first message appeared for 1 minute, and after it was gone, they had an extra minute to process it. Then another message has appeared that also had an extra minute to process it afterwards. The first message signified that participants' character fired some of the workers in this factory, and they were responsible for it. And the second message signified that those former workers protesting outside, creating a stressful, unusual situation. There were 4 groups in the study. 24 participants were randomly assigned to each of them. Those without the perspective taking task were reminded to think out loud. Those with the perspective taking task were asked what they think, what the character may feel or think in this situation. Then we analyzed their thinking from the audio recordings. The perspective-taking expressions were measured through the lens of time participant thought about the character's thoughts and feelings. This was quantified with the content analysis. After the initial training, two independent quarters reached an appropriate reliability regarding the identified instances of perspective taking. I mean, the number of them. However, with the coding time length, coders had to go through 2 rounds of retraining, and at the same time, all coding involved the differentiation of 4 types of perspective taking. As control measures, we had a perspective taking trait through the subscale of the IRA index, sense of embodiment, and a number of task reminders identified through the content analysis as well. So as a result of a study, point of view had no effect on perspective taking, whether in first-person perspective or the third-person perspective. Only participants who were asked to think about their characters' thoughts or feelings thought about them. Task reminder was the only additional but yet negative predictor of perspective taking. At the same time, first-person perspective induced a higher sense of embodiment as expected. And we found no differences, whether within or between different types of perspective taking. In the end, just using an avatar in VR does not promote perspective taking. Neither first-person perspective nor a higher sense of embodiment makes us take the perspective of others. We remain ourselves and interpret the incoming stimuli based on who we are. Perspective taking is a cognitive effort and doesn't happen easily. To induce perspective taking, VR designers should stimulate it more proactively. At the same time, VR researchers should focus on the perspective taking expressions rather than on perspective traits. I mean, they need to measure what people think to study perspective taking. Finally, perspective taking studies in VR should stop simplifying marginalized experiences into simple virtual scenes. In future, we need to try to make perspective tasks in those environments less directive and explicit. Well, thank you for your attention and feel free to approach me with any questions.